A whip cracks in the morning air. A mother lies broken on the kitchen floor, punished again for bearing daughters instead of sons. But when the overseer raises his arm for another strike, an 8-year-old child steps between them, eyes blazing with fury no child should know. The plantation heir returns home just as the leather falls and everything changes in a heartbeat. Thunder rolls across the cotton fields. A lantern swings through fog-thick darkness as they flee toward the river. But the child sees something in the travel papers that makes her blood run cold, the wrong color wax, the wrong curve of a letter. Someone has forged their passage to freedom. Dogs howl in the distance. Patrollers ride hard through the storm, and hidden in the pages of a family Bible lies a secret that could save them all or destroy everyone who dares to speak it. The courthouse bell tolls at dawn. The town gathers. The truth waits to be spoken. When a man's conscience collides with a lifetime of custom and a child's perfect memory holds the key to justice, who will find the courage to say the words that change everything forever? The steam curled up like a veil when the boots crossed the threshold. Ruth lay on the corn shuck mattress, her body still tender from the birthing 3 days past. The kitchen air hung thick with herb steam, Aunt Dinah's tonics bubbling in the iron pot, chamomile and willow bark to ease the ache in Ruth's bones. Outside, roosters called the plantation to wakefulness. Inside, little Mercy slept against Ruth's side, a scrap of life no bigger than a loaf of bread. Lila hummed under her breath, a low melody that seemed to make the very air gentler. At 8 years old, she moved like water around the kitchen, her feet knowing every creaking board. The ribboned locket at her throat caught the first light through the window, a thing her grandmother had pressed into her palm before the fever took her. For remembering, grandmother had whispered, and Lila did remember. Everything. Another girl, came the kitchen maid's voice from the doorway. Overseers coming to inspect. Aunt Dinah's hand stilled on the herb pot. Ruth's breathing went shallow. The dogs outside began their barking, the kind that meant boots on the path, authority walking heavy toward the kitchen. Lila's humming never stopped, but it changed. Lower, steadier, like a hand on a frightened horse's neck. The steam from Dinah's pot rose and twisted, carrying the scent of healing herbs into air that suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Ruth's fingers found Lila's hand. The child's palm was warm and dry, steady as stone. "Mama," Lila whispered, her voice threading through the steam. "Remember the song about the sparrow and the wheat field?" Ruth nodded. The song meant, "Be small, be quiet, let the storm pass over." But as the boots grew louder on the porch boards, Ruth wondered if there was any storm big enough to wash away what was coming. The boots stopped, just outside the kitchen door. The whip froze mid-air when a male voice said, "Enough." Silas Crow stood with his arm raised, leather coiled in his fist like a snake waiting to strike. His face was red as brick dust, and his belt bore the same scratched pattern Ruth had seen on the plantation ledgers, little marks where he'd tallied things that didn't belong to him. "Girls again," he'd snarled when he'd seen the baby. "This woman's useless as a broken plow. Master Edmund's been patient, but patience has a price." Ruth had closed her eyes and tried to make herself smaller on the mattress. But Lila, brave, foolish Lila, had stepped between her mother and the overseer. 8 years old and no taller than a fence post, but she stood there with her chin up and her locket catching the morning light. "Step away from my mama," she'd said, her voice clear as church bells. And that's when Silas raised the whip. But the voice that said "enough" didn't belong to an 8-year-old girl. It came from the doorway, where Thomas Hale stood backlit by the rising sun, his traveling coat still dusty from the road. Thomas was the plantation heir, Master Edmund's sickly son who'd been away at university for 2 years. Ruth had heard the house servants whispering that he'd come home changed thinner, quieter, with eyes that seemed to see too much. He stood in the kitchen doorway now like a man who'd lost something important and wasn't sure what it was. "Mr. Thomas," Silas said, lowering the whip but keeping his grip tight. "This is plantation business. The woman needs correction." "For what?" Thomas stepped into the kitchen. His boots were different from Silas's softer leather, quieter steps. "For giving birth. For giving useless birth. Girls eat as much as boys but can't work the fields proper when they're grown. Master Edmund, your late father had rules about productivity." The words hit the kitchen like stones thrown into still water. Master Edmund was dead. Ruth felt the news settle into her chest, heavy and cold. She'd known the man was ailing, but death changed everything. It meant Thomas was master now, and masters could do what they pleased. Lila pressed closer to Ruth's side. Her humming had stopped, but her breathing stayed steady in and out, like she was setting a rhythm for the whole room to follow. Ruth's own heartbeat began to slow, matching the tempo of her daughter's breath. "My father," Thomas said quietly, "is 3 days buried, and you're welcoming me home by beating a woman still weak from childbirth." Silas's jaw worked like he was chewing something bitter. "The ledgers need balancing, sir. The estate's in debt, and hard choices. Show me the ledgers." The words came out sharp enough to cut glass. Silas's hand moved to the account book tucked under his arm, clutching it tight. "Now," Thomas said. And that's when Lila spoke up, her voice soft but carrying clear across the kitchen. "There's numbers in that book that don't belong." Thomas's finger tapped the empty column where Lila swore a figure lived. The ledger lay open on the kitchen table, its pages yellowed with age and marked with scratches from countless calculations. Silas stood to one side, his face growing redder by the minute. Thomas leaned over the book, studying the columns that Lila had described in perfect detail, down to the smudged ink mark shaped like a bird's wing. "This entry here," Lila said, pointing to a line near the bottom of the page. "It says feed costs, $47.30. But yesterday you wrote the same amount on the line above. I saw it when you left the book open by the well." Silas snorted. "Girls making up stories. Slaves can't read." "I can't read the letters," Lila said calmly, "but I remember the shapes. That 4 has a little tail, and the 7 leans left like it's trying to lie down. You wrote it twice." Thomas ran his finger down the columns, his brow furrowed. Ruth watched from the mattress, little Mercy stirring in her arms. The baby was so small, so perfect, 10 tiny fingers, 10 tiny toes, and lungs that could fill the whole world with her cry when she wanted feeding. "There," Lila continued, her voice gaining strength, "and there. Same numbers, different lines. And in the back pages, the ones with the red ribbon, there's marks for babies sold but no names written down. 3 marks last month, but only 1 baby died that I know of." The kitchen went deadly quiet. Even the dogs outside had stopped their barking. Thomas looked up from the ledger, his eyes moving from Lila to Silas and back again. "That's a serious accusation," he said slowly. "It's a lying child's babbling." Silas shot back. "She couldn't know what's in those back pages." "There." He stopped himself too late. Thomas's eyes sharpened. "They're what, Silas? If she can't read, how would she know about red ribbon markers unless she's seen them?" Silas's hand moved to his belt, the one with the scratched marks that matched the ledger's margins. "Little tallies," Ruth realized now. "A mark for every theft, every baby sold off the books, every dollar skimmed from the estate's accounts." "I keep good records," Silas said, but his voice had lost its certainty. "Master Edmund my father trusted you to run the plantation honestly." Thomas closed the ledger with a soft thud. "If this child is right about the duplicate entries, we'll know soon enough. The county clerk keeps copies of all major transactions." Ruth felt hope flutter in her chest like a bird trying to find a safe place to roost. But hope was dangerous for people like her. It made you careless, made you forget that the law was written by men who didn't think she was quite human enough to matter. Lila reached for her locket, fingers wrapping around the small silver oval. Inside was a curl of her grandmother's hair and a tiny paper with words Ruth couldn't read. Grandmother had said it was a blessing, a prayer for protection. Looking at her daughter now brave and steady and too clever for her own good, Ruth thought maybe prayers sometimes wore pigtails and calico dresses. Outside, she heard the creak of wagon wheels and the jingle of harness. Someone was coming up the drive, and Silas's face had gone white as cotton. "We'll continue this discussion later," Thomas said, but his eyes stayed on Silas, watchful and wary. "For now, I want Ruth moved to the porch where she can get proper air, and I want that baby checked by someone who knows about such things." "Can't do it," Silas said quickly. "Woman's slated for auction next week. Balance the books, pay down debts. She's not available for coddling." The hope in Ruth's chest froze solid. Auction meant separation from her girls, from everything she'd ever known. It meant standing on a platform while strangers examined her teeth and felt her arms for muscle, deciding what she was worth by the pound. But Lila stepped forward, her small hand reaching into her dress pocket. "The paper you showed the house servants yesterday?" she said to Silas. "The one that says you can move, Mama. What color was the wax?" Silas's eyes narrowed. "What? The seal on the paper. What color?" "I don't see why." "Because," Lila said, her voice carrying that clear, bell-like quality that made everyone listen, "the clerk always uses oxblood wax. Dark red, like old blood, but the seal on your paper looked like dried brick." The silence stretched tight as a rope about to snap. The seal's wax looked the color of dried brick, not the clerk's oxblood. Thomas studied the paper. Silas had reluctantly produced a travel pass that would legally allow Ruth to be transported for sale. The wax seal at the bottom caught the morning light, its reddish-brown surface looking somehow wrong, like a word spelled almost correctly but not quite. "I ain't responsible for what color wax the clerk chooses," Silas muttered. "Man's got his ways." But Lila shook her head, her finger tracing the air above the seal without touching it. "Mr. Josiah Pike been clerk for 7 years. Every paper that comes through his office gets the same oxblood wax from the same stick. I seen it when Daddy used to take me to town. This wax is different." Ruth's breath caught. Lila's daddy had been sold away when the child was 5, but her memory was like a spring, clear and deep, and never running dry. If she said she remembered the color of the clerk's wax, then she remembered true. "Girls got sharp eyes," Thomas said quietly. He held the paper up to the light streaming through the kitchen window. Too sharp, maybe, for her own good. The threat hung in the air between them. Smart slaves were dangerous slaves, and dangerous slaves had short lives. Ruth pulled Leela closer, feeling her daughter's heartbeat quick and steady against her side. Outside, the wagon wheels had stopped. Boots hit the ground more than one pair. Voices carried on the morning air, low and official. Patrollers, most likely, making their rounds to ensure no slave moved without proper papers. Silas straightened, his confidence returning. "Whatever game you're playing, boy, it ends here. I got legal authority to move that woman, and I got men outside to back me up. Your daddy might have spoiled you with books and learning, but this is plantation business now." Thomas folded the paper carefully and slipped it into his coat pocket. When he looked up, his face had changed less of the uncertain young man and more of the master he was born to be. "You're right about one thing," he said. "This is plantation business. My plantation, my business." He walked to the kitchen door and pushed it open. The morning light poured in, bright and clean and full of promise. On the porch, 3 men waited, 2 patrollers with their badges and guns, and a third man Ruth didn't recognize. "Gentlemen," Thomas called out. "Good morning. I trust you're here on official business?" The lead patroller touched his hat brim. "Morning, Mr. Hale. Silas sent word you might have trouble with a slave trying to avoid lawful transport. We're here to assist." How thoughtful of him. Thomas stepped fully onto the porch, leaving the door wide so his voice would carry back to the kitchen. "Though I believe there's been some confusion, the woman in question is under my direct protection while we investigate certain irregularities in the plantation records." Ruth heard Silas curse under his breath. Lila's hand found hers, small fingers intertwining with her own. "What kind of irregularities?" the patroller asked. "The kind that might interest the county magistrate," Thomas said smoothly. "Questions about forged documents, unauthorized sales, misappropriated funds, the sort of thing that requires careful review before anyone is moved anywhere." The silence from the porch was deafening. Ruth could hear her own heartbeat, could feel Lila's breathing slow and deepen, like she was preparing for something. Then Silas pushed past them, striding onto the porch with his chest puffed out like a rooster's. "These are serious accusations, boy. You'd better have proof." Thomas smiled, not a friendly smile, but the kind that showed teeth. "Funny thing about proof," he said. "It has a way of turning up in the most interesting places." The crowd hushed when Lila said, "That letter never curls like that." The morning had drawn spectators like honey draws flies. Word traveled fast on a plantation, and by the time Thomas called for the account book to be brought into the sunlight, a dozen field hands had found reasons to drift close to the big house. They stood at a careful distance, close enough to hear, far enough to claim they were working if anyone asked. Silas clutched the ledger against his chest like a man holding his last dollar. The patrollers flanked him on either side, their hands resting easy on their gun belts. But their Eyes kept shifting between Thomas and the paper he'd pulled from his coat pocket. "Show them the seal," Thomas said quietly. Reluctantly, Silas held up the travel pass. The wax seal glinted in the sun, its brick-red color obvious now against the white paper. Even the patrollers could see something was off. "Clerk's wax changes color in different weather," Silas said, but his voice had lost its bluster. "Humidity affects the mixture." "Maybe," Thomas agreed. "But what about the letter form?" He gestured to Leela, who stepped forward despite Ruth's whispered plea to stay back. The child looked impossibly small, standing on the big house porch, with all those men looming over her, but her voice carried clear and strong. "The P in Pike's signature," she said, pointing to the bottom of the travel pass. "It's got a curl at the bottom that don't belong. Mr. Pike writes his P with a straight stem, no fancy curls. I watched him sign papers for 3 different masters last winter when they brought me to town." The lead patroller leaned in for a closer look. Ruth saw his eyebrows rise. "Girl might have something there," he said slowly. "That is one elaborate P. Most clerks keep their writing simple for official documents." Silas snatched the paper back. "You're taking the word of a slave child over a white man's authority? That's dangerous precedent, Jake." But Jake the patroller was already shaking his head. "Maybe so. But if that seal's a forgery, we got bigger problems than one woman's transport. Forged papers is a federal offense." The words hit like stones thrown into a pond, sending ripples of tension through the gathered crowd. Ruth felt something shift in the air around them, a change in the wind that might blow toward justice or toward disaster. Thomas stepped forward, his voice carrying the authority of ownership now. "I'm calling for a public examination of these documents," he announced, "and until questions about their authenticity are settled, the woman and her children remain under my protection." The field hands murmured among themselves. A few nodded approval. Others kept their faces carefully blank, but Ruth saw hope flickering in their eyes like firelight in a dark room. Silas's face had gone purple with rage. "You can't do this. I got authority from your daddy's own will. My father is dead," Thomas said flatly. "His will is being read tomorrow. Until then, I am master of this plantation, and my word is law here." He turned to face the crowd that had gathered field hands and house servants, patrollers and neighbors drawn by the commotion. When he spoke, his voice carried to every corner of the yard. "I want it understood by all present. Ruth and her daughters are under my direct protection. Any man who attempts to move them against my will shall answer to me personally." The silence that followed was pregnant with possibility. Ruth felt Lila's hand squeeze hers, the child's fingers strong and warm. Then Thomas did something that stopped Ruth's breath in her throat. He looked directly at her, not past her, not through her, but at her like she was human enough to matter. "You're coming with me," he said, his words carrying clear across the porch and into the yard, where 24 people stood witness. It was a promise and a declaration, a line drawn in the sand that couldn't be uncrossed. And for the first time since her baby was born, Ruth allowed herself to believe that maybe, just maybe, the storm might pass them by after all. But even as hope bloomed in her chest, she saw Silas lean toward the lead patroller and whisper something that made the man's hand move to his gun. The wind was changing, all right, but which way it would blow, only heaven knew. Thomas lifted the lantern from the nail as the sun burned white on the ferry road. The afternoon had moved like molasses, thick with tension and the weight of decisions made in front of witnesses. After the confrontation on the porch, Thomas had ordered Ruth move to the shade of the magnolia tree, where she could rest with little mercy while Lila kept watch. He'd spent 2 hours going through the ledger with a fine-tooth comb, marking inconsistencies with a pencil stub and making notes in the margins. The field hands had dispersed slowly, reluctant to leave the drama unfinished, but work was work, and the cotton wouldn't pick itself. By evening, only the core players remained, Thomas, Ruth, Lila, and Silas, who'd spent the afternoon pacing the porch like a caged animal. The patrollers had left with promises to return in the morning with the county clerk. "Let Pike himself examine his seal," Jake had said. "We'll know soon enough who's telling truth and who ain't." That's when Silas had played his last card. "Fine," he'd snarled as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. "You want to protect your slaves so bad? Then you can meet me in town tomorrow morning." I'll have witnesses of my own, and we'll settle this proper before the magistrate. He'd mounted his horse then, pausing only to deliver a final threat. That woman and her bastards better be in town by first light, or I'll have warrants sworn out for theft and conspiracy. And boy, his eyes had fixed on Thomas like a snake studying a mouse. Your daddy might have been soft, but the law ain't. The law knows what slaves are worth. Now the sun hung low and red over the cotton fields, painting the world the color of dried blood. Thomas stood on the porch with the lantern in his hand, its metal warm from the day's heat. Inside the glass chimney, the wick waited for flame. "We need to go," he said quietly. Ruth nodded from her place under the magnolia. She'd gained strength through the day, Aunt Dinah's tonics doing their work, but she was still pale and drawn. Little Mercy slept in her arms, blissfully unaware that her 3 days of life had already been marked by more drama than most folks saw in a year. Lila stood, beside her mother, the ribboned locket at her throat catching the evening light. She'd been quiet since the confrontation, her sharp eyes taking in everything and storing it away in that remarkable memory of hers. "How far to town?" Ruth asked. 8 miles by the main road," Thomas said. "But we're not taking the main road. Too many patrols, too many chances for Silas to set an ambush. We'll go by the ferry path longer, but safer." He struck a match and lit the lantern. The flame caught and steadied, pushing back the gathering dusk. Its light would be their guide through the dark hours ahead, a small sun to carry them toward whatever waited in town. "Mama," Lila said softly. "I'm scared." Ruth's arm tightened around her daughter. "I know, baby, but sometimes scared is what keeps us careful, and careful is what keeps us alive." Thomas shouldered a pack with food and blankets. His horse was already saddled, but the animal wouldn't carry all of them. They'd need to walk part of the way, following paths that only the ferry workers and runaway slaves knew well. "The mule's in the stable," he said. "Old Caesar. He's gentle and sure-footed. Can you ride, Lila?" The child nodded. "Bareback. Never had a proper saddle. Bareback it is then. Your mother can ride behind you with the baby, and I'll walk alongside. We'll make better time that way." As they prepared to leave, Aunt Dinah emerged from the kitchen with a small bundle wrapped in oilcloth. Her eyes were red from crying, but her voice was steady. "Herbs for the baby," she said, pressing the bundle into Ruth's hands. "And something for pain, if it gets too much to bear." She hugged Ruth then, a fierce embrace that spoke of years of shared hardship and small kindnesses. "You be strong now," she whispered. "That child of yours got the sight. She sees things others miss. You listen to her." Ruth nodded, unable to speak around the tightness in her throat. Thomas swung the lantern in a wide arc, its light sweeping across the yard and picking out the path that led toward the river. Somewhere in the distance, dogs barked a sound that made all of them freeze for a moment. "Hunting dogs," Thomas said quietly, "but not close, not yet." He looked at Ruth and Lila, two figures silhouetted against the dying light. A woman still weak from childbirth, a child too young to understand the full weight of what they faced, and a baby small enough to hold in one hand. It was a pitifully small rebellion against the order of things. But as the lantern light caught Lila's face, Thomas saw something in her eyes that made him think of flint striking steel. This child, this remarkable, sharp-eyed child, might just be the spark they needed to burn away the lies and bring the truth to light. "Ready?" he asked. Lila's hand found her mother's. "Ready." And together, they stepped into the gathering darkness, following the uncertain path toward hope. The curfew nears. They move by mule to the ferry, landing. Lila's perfect pitch soft sings, quieting the dogs. Fog rolls. Jonah warns of a storm and patrollers ahead. The ferry road wound through scrub pine and sweet gum, its packed dirt surface scarred by wagon wheels and marked with the deep prints of oxen. Thomas walked alongside the mule, one hand on the lead rope, the other holding the lantern high. Its circle of light bobbed and swayed with each step, pushing back shadows that seemed to lean in from all sides. Ruth rode behind Lila, the baby tucked safe in a sling across her chest. Little Mercy had stirred once when they started moving, but the steady rhythm of the mule's gait had lulled her back to sleep. Lila sat straight-backed and alert, her hands gentle on the reins, her eyes scanning the darkness ahead. "Dogs again," Ruth whispered as the baying drifted across the night air. "Hush," Lila said softly, and began to hum. The melody was low and sweet, threading through the darkness like silver wire. It was an old song, older than slavery, older than the plantation, older than memory itself, a tune that spoke of deep woods and safe places, of mothers calling their children home. The distant barking wavered, then quieted. Even the mule's ears pricked forward, as if the music made the path easier to follow. "How does she do that?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Ruth smiled in the darkness. "Perfect pitch runs in the bloodline. My grandmother could call birds from the trees with just a whistle. Said it was a gift from the old country, before the ships came." They crested a small hill and the river appeared below them, a ribbon of black water reflecting the few stars that showed through the clouds. The ferry landing was a rough collection of wooden pilings and rope, with a small shack where the ferryman kept his tools. But it was the fog that made Thomas pull up short. It rolled across the water like a living thing, thick and white and impenetrable. In minutes, it would swallow the landing completely, making any crossing impossible until dawn. "Well, damn," he muttered. A figure emerged from the shack, tall and lean, with the gnarled hands of a man who'd spent his life working rope and water. Jonah Reed had been running the ferry for 20 years, and his weathered face showed every season of it. "Evening, Mr. Thomas," he called out. "You're cutting it mighty close. Fog's coming in thick, and there's weather behind it. Big storm, maybe." Thomas approached the landing, leading the mule carefully down the slippery bank. "We need to cross tonight, Jonah. It's important." Jonah studied them, the young master, the slave woman with her baby, the sharp-eyed child on the mule. His expression gave nothing away. "Can't do it," he said finally. "Ferry won't hold in this fog, and that storm's bringing wind that'll tear the rope clean through. You'll have to wait for morning. We can't wait." Thomas set the lantern down and pulled out a leather pouch from his coat. The coins inside clinked softly together. "Name your price." But Jonah was already shaking his head. "Ain't about money, son. It's about staying alive. That water's treacherous enough in daylight. In fog like this, with a storm coming, might as well put a gun to your head and pull the trigger." As if summoned by his words, the fog reached the landing and began to swirl around their ankles. In moments, they were wrapped in a white cocoon that muffled sound and turned the world into a ghostly maze. Lila slipped down from the mule and walked to the water's edge. The fog parted around her like she was walking through spider webs, and her humming took on a different quality, clearer, more purposeful. "Child's got an ear for water," Jonah said, watching her. "That melody she's singing, it's an old ferryman's tune. Haven't heard it in years." "You know it?" Thomas asked. "My daddy taught it to me when I was knee-high to a grasshopper. Said it was for finding your way when the world went white. But I ain't heard nobody else sing it since he died." Lila turned back to them, her young face serious in the lantern light. "The path's still there. I can hear it in the current. But there's men coming down the road behind us, horses and dogs." Thomas felt his blood turn cold. "How many?" "Ah, 3 riders, maybe 4, and they're moving fast." Through the fog, they heard it then, the drumbeat of hooves on packed earth, growing louder by the minute. Silas hadn't waited for morning after all. "Get them on the ferry," Thomas said urgently. "Now." But Jonah held up his hand. "Wait. Listen." In the distance, barely audible over the sound of approaching horses, came another noise, the deep rumble of thunder, still miles away but moving steadily closer. "That storm's bigger than I thought," Jonah said grimly. "Lightning, wind, rain, the whole arsenal. Ferry won't survive it." The hoofbeats were getting closer. Through the fog, they could see the faint glow of torches bobbing in the darkness. Thomas looked at Ruth, then at Lila, then at the baby sleeping peacefully in her mother's arms. 3 lives hanging in the balance, and no good choices left. "There's another way," Lila said quietly. "The old church on Willowbrook Creek. It's got a root cellar, and the creek connects to the river downstream. We could hide there until the storm passes." "That's 5 miles through swamp," Jonah protested. "And the church ain't been used in years. Place is probably falling down." "It's still standing," Lila said with certainty. "I heard the bell tower in the wind last time we came this way, and the cellar stays dry. I can smell it from here." The child's senses were uncanny, sharp as a hawk's, and twice as reliable. If she said the church was safe, Thomas believed her. "Can you guide us there in the fog?" he asked. Lila nodded. Follow the song. And before anyone could object, she began to hum again, a different melody this time, one that seemed to pull them toward the darkness beyond the landing. The fog swirled and eddied around her small form as she led them away from the river, away from the approaching riders, and into the maze of creeks and backwater that crisscrossed the countryside like veins in a leaf. Behind them, the torches reached the ferry landing, just as the first drops of rain began to fall. Mid-river storm, lantern nearly lost, ferry slams a piling. They shelter in a church basement with quilts and trunks. The storm caught them halfway across Willowbrook Creek. They'd found the old ferry, a flat-bottomed scow barely wide enough for the mule and its passengers, tied to a cypress stump with rope gone green with moss. Jonah had followed them through the fog, his conscience winning out over his caution. "If you're determined to get yourselves drowned," he'd muttered, "least I can do is help you do it proper." The creek was narrow but deep, its black water smooth as glass under the fog. Lila stood at the bow, humming her navigation song while Jonah worked the pole. The mule stood patient and still in the center of the ferry, Ruth and the baby secure on its back. Thomas held the lantern high, its light creating a small bubble of visibility in the white world around them. The ancient church loomed somewhere ahead, its bell tower, a landmark that only Lila could sense through the murk. Then the wind hit. It came from the west like a charging bull, ripping the fog apart and sending the little ferry spinning sideways in the current. The mule snorted and shuffled, its hooves scraping against the wet planks. Ruth tightened her grip on the baby, who'd awakened with a startled cry. "Hold fast!" Jonah shouted, fighting the pole against the suddenly angry water. The lantern swung wildly in Thomas's grip, its flame guttering in the wind. For a heart-stopping moment, it seemed the light would die, leaving them blind in the storm. But Thomas cupped his free hand around the chimney, protecting the flame until it steadied. Rain began to fall in heavy drops, pocking the creek's surface like scattered coins. Within minutes, it became a torrent that soaked them to the skin and turned the ferry's deck slippery as ice. The current caught them then, spinning the ferry toward a massive cypress whose roots jutted from the water like the fingers of a drowned giant. Jonah threw his full weight against the pole, muscles straining, but the storm was stronger. They hit the tree with a bone-jarring crash that sent them all sprawling. The mule's front hooves slipped off the edge of the deck, and for a terrifying instant, it seemed the animal would fall into the black water. But Lila moved like lightning, grabbing the lead rope and pulling with all her small strength. "Easy, Caesar," she sang to the mule, her voice cutting through wind and rain. "Easy now. Find your footing." The old animal responded to her voice, scrambling back onto solid planks with a grunt of effort. But the ferry was taking, on water now, listing to one side as the storm tried to tear it apart. "There." Lila pointed through the rain toward a dim shape on the creek bank. "The church. Street." Mary's of the Willows had been abandoned for 15 years, but its stone walls still stood solid against the storm. The bell tower rose like a finger pointing toward heaven, and stained glass windows, though cracked and dark, still held their sacred images. Jonah fought the current and the wind, using his pole like a weapon against the water. Inch by inch, he forced the ferry toward the muddy bank where a stone dock waited, slick with rain and treacherous in the darkness. They made the landing just as lightning split the sky, illuminating the creek in stark white relief. The thunder that followed shook the church walls and sent every bird within miles shrieking into the night. "Inside!" Thomas shouted, grabbing gear from the ferry. "Before the next wave hits!" They ran for the church like souls fleeing judgment, the mule splashing through puddles and mud while rain lashed down from the black sky. The church door hung crooked on its hinges, but it still opened to Thomas's shoulder, revealing the dark sanctuary beyond. Lila was the first inside, her feet finding the path by memory and instinct. "This way," she called. To the cellar, behind the altar, hidden by a curtain thick with dust and cobwebs, they found the stairs leading down into darkness. The cellar was surprisingly dry stone walls and a raised wooden floor that had kept the floodwaters out for generations. In the lantern light, they could see the cellar had been used as a storage space. Old quilts lay folded in cedar chests, their colors faded but their warmth intact. Canned goods lined wooden shelves, peaches and beans, and preserves put up by the congregation before the church closed. Ruth sank gratefully onto a pile of quilts, the baby finally calm in her arms. Lila explored the cellar like a cat in a new house, her fingers trailing along the stone walls and testing the wooden floor for weak spots. "We're safe here," she announced. "The water never comes this high, and the walls are strong. We can wait out the storm." Thomas set the lantern on a wooden crate and looked around their makeshift shelter. It wasn't much a cellar beneath an abandoned church, musty with disuse and filled with the ghosts of old prayers, but it was dry and hidden, and the storm couldn't reach them here. Outside, the wind howled like a thing in pain, and rain drummed against the church roof with the persistence of marching soldiers. But inside their stone cocoon, wrapped in musty quilts and warmed by the lantern's glow, they were beyond the reach of Silas Crow and his riders. "How did you know about this place?" Thomas asked Lila. The child settled beside her mother, her dress still dripping from the storm. "Daddy brought me here once, when I was little, before they sold him away. He said this church was a safe harbor, a confident place where folks could rest between one life and the next." She pulled out her locket and opened it, revealing the curl of hair inside. "He left this here for me, hidden under the altar. Said if I ever needed to remember where I came from, this place would help." Thunder crashed overhead, so loud it seemed to shake dust from the ceiling stones. But in the cellar, surrounded by old quilts and faded memories, Ruth felt something she hadn't experienced in years. Peace. Not the uneasy quiet of exhaustion, but the deep rest that came from knowing, if only for a few hours, that she and her children were beyond harm's reach. Little Mercy stirred against her chest, making the small sounds babies make when they dream. Ruth looked down at her youngest daughter and smiled. Tomorrow would bring new dangers, new choices, new tests of courage and faith. But tonight, in this forgotten sanctuary beneath the storm, they were simply a mother and her children, sheltered by stone walls and watched over by whatever angels still lingered in sacred spaces. Lila began to hum again, not a navigation song this time, but a lullaby her grandmother had taught her. The melody rose and fell like gentle breathing, wrapping around them all like another layer of quilts. Outside, the storm raged on. But inside their stone refuge, Thomas felt something shift in his chest, a warmth that had nothing to do with the lantern's flame and everything to do with the simple miracle of 3 lives preserved against the darkness. He'd been born to privilege, raised in comfort, educated in the ways of ownership and authority. But sitting here in the cellar of an abandoned church, listening to a slave child's lullaby while her mother held a baby born into bondage, he understood something his books had never taught him. Freedom wasn't something you were born with. It was something you had to earn not through inheritance or education, but through the simple, dangerous act of standing between cruelty and its victims. The storm would pass, morning would come, and when it did, they would have to face whatever waited in the world above. But for now, wrapped in old quilts and surrounded by the ghosts of old prayers, they were free. At dawn, a kindly clerk lets Thomas inspect ledgers, sums and sales match Lila's memory. A Bible margin note, late owner's hand, surfaces. The storm had passed before first light, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming. Puddles reflected the pale sky like scattered mirrors, and the air smelled of rain and river mud and growing things. Thomas stood at the church's front steps, watching steam rise from the wet earth, while Lila and Ruth gathered their few belongings. The mule had weathered the storm well, standing patient in the church's covered alcove, where they'd sheltered it after the worst of the wind passed. Now it munched contentedly on grass that had been beaten flat by the rain, its brown eyes peaceful in the morning light. "Towns, too, miles downstream," Thomas said, studying the swollen creek that rushed past the church. "But the roads will be mud for hours. We'll need to go careful." Ruth emerged from the church, with little Mercy bundled against her chest. The baby was awake and alert, her dark eyes taking in this new world with the grave attention of the very young. She hadn't cried once during the storm, as if she understood that silence might mean survival. "I can walk," Ruth said, though Thomas could see the effort it cost her. The birthing had taken its toll, and a night on stone floors hadn't helped. But her voice was steady, her chin up. "Walking's better than riding when the path's uncertain." Lila came last, her arms full of quilts that she'd somehow convinced the others they should take. "For the doctor's place," she explained when Thomas raised an eyebrow. "If we need to shelter again." The child's practical wisdom never ceased to amaze him. She saw 3 moves ahead like a chess master, anticipating needs before they arose. They made their way carefully along the creek bank, following a fisherman's path that was slick with mud but passable. The storm had brought down branches and filled the air with the green smell of broken leaves. Birds called from the trees, their songs bright and complex after the night silence. Town appeared around a bend in the creek, a collection of brick buildings and wooden shops clustered around a courthouse square. Smoke rose from chimneys, and early shopkeepers were already sweeping storm debris from their stoops. It looked like civilization, like law and order, like the kind of place where justice might actually be possible. But Thomas knew appearances could lie. "The clerk's office is in the courthouse basement," he told them as they approached the town's edge. "Josiah Pike. He's been there 7 years, just like Lila said. If anyone can verify whether that seal was forged, it's him." They made their way through puddle-strewn streets, the mules' hooves splashing softly on wet cobblestones. A few early risers watched them pass, a young white man leading a mule, a black woman walking behind with a baby, and a child who moved like she knew exactly where she was going. It was the kind of sight that usually drew questions, but the storm had given everyone more pressing concerns. Shop owners were assessing damage to their storefronts, and housewives were hanging soggy laundry in the pale morning sun. The courthouse was a solid brick building with tall windows and a clock tower that chimed the hours. Its basement office was reached by a side entrance that led down stone steps worn smooth by years of petitioners and clerks. They found Josiah Pike at his desk, examining water damage to a stack of documents. He was a thin man with precise movements and wire spectacles, the kind of person who noticed details others missed. When he looked up at their approach, his eyes went immediately to Lila. "Well, Albie," he said softly, "you're the little girl who watches me sign papers." Lila nodded gravely. "Yes, sir." "I remember things." Pike smiled, the first genuinely friendly expression they'd encountered since leaving the plantation. "I imagine you do. Come in, all of you. What brings you to my office after such a night?" Thomas explained quickly the questionable seal, the disputed travel pass, the accusations of forgery and fraud. Pike listened without interruption, his thin fingers steepled beneath his chin. When Thomas finished, Pike held out his hand. "Let me see the document in question." Thomas produced the travel pass, now somewhat worse for wear after their night in the storm. Pike examined it carefully, holding it up to the morning light that streamed through the basement window. He said after a long moment. "This is interesting indeed." He walked to a tall cabinet and removed a wooden box filled with sealing wax sticks. Each was labeled with a year and stored in a separate compartment. From 1847, he selected a stick of deep red wax, the color of old blood. "This is what I use for all official documents," he said, holding the stick beside the seal on the travel pass. "Oxblood red, imported from Boston. Notice the difference? Even Thomas could see it now." The seal on Silas's document was clearly brick-colored, a cheaper wax available at any general store. "And the letter form?" Lila asked. Pike smiled and opened a ledger to show them his signature. The P in Pike was clean and simple, with a straight stem and no decorative flourishes. "I learned penmanship from a Quaker schoolmaster," he said. "Plain style, no ornamentation. Whoever forged this signature has a tendency toward the dramatic." He walked to another cabinet and withdrew several ledgers bound in brown leather. "These are copies of all official transactions from the past 2 years. If Overseer Crow has been conducting unauthorized sales, there should be discrepancies between his records and mine." They spent an hour going through the books, with Lila calling out numbers from memory while Pike checked them against his records. The pattern was clear: duplicated entries, missing children, fees charged twice for the same services. "Your memory is remarkable, child," Pike said when they finished. "Every figure you've cited matches my records exactly. Whoever taught you to notice such details did you a great service." "Nobody taught me," Lila said simply. "I just remember things the way they are." Pike nodded thoughtfully. "A gift, then. And a valuable one." He was closing the ledgers when something caught his attention, a thin book bound in black leather that had been tucked behind the others. He pulled it out and opened it, his eyebrows rising. "Well, I'll be blessed," he murmured. I'd forgotten about this. It was a Bible, its pages yellowed with age and its margins filled with handwritten notes. On the inside cover, in fading brown ink, was written, "Property of Edmund, Hale. Your father left this with me last winter," Pike told Thomas. "Said he wanted it kept safe while he was ailing. There's something in the margins you should see." He turned to the book of Exodus and pointed to a note written in Edmund's careful script. "If Ruth and her daughters remain together and in good health, they shall be freed upon my death, as befits a Christian conscience. Let no man separate what God has joined in the bonds of motherhood." The silence that followed was profound. Ruth's hand went to her throat, and Lila stepped closer to her mother's side. Even little Mercy seemed to sense the importance of the moment, her dark eyes wide and solemn. "Is that legal?" Thomas asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Pike adjusted his spectacles and studied the note carefully. "In most cases, no. Slaves are considered property, and property passes according to the will. But," he paused, considering, "if this can be proven to be your father's authentic handwriting, and if it's coupled with evidence of fraud in the estate's management, a magistrate might consider it a codicil to the will. Especially if the fraud was committed to prevent its execution." Thomas felt the world shift beneath his feet. His father, the man he'd thought of as weak, as complicit in the plantation's cruelties, had planned for this moment. Had seen some spark of humanity in Ruth and her children that was worth preserving. "The handwriting," he said urgently. "Can you verify it?" Pike smiled and produced a folder of documents. "Your father did business with me for 20 years. I have samples of his signature and script going back decades. This note is definitely his work." Ruth made a sound, half laugh, half sob. Her legs seemed to give way, and she sat down heavily in the chair Pike offered, clutching the baby to her chest. "Free," she whispered. He said, "Free." Lila knelt beside her mother's chair, her small hand covering Ruth's larger one. "Mama, we're going to be free. If," Thomas said carefully, "we can prove the fraud and get a magistrate to honor the note. Silas won't give up easily, and there are men in this town who profit from the slave trade. We're not safe yet." Pike was already moving, gathering documents and sealing them with his official wax. "Judge Cole is fair, but he's also practical. He'll want proof, witnesses, and a clear legal argument. But if you've got all that—" He didn't finish the sentence, but the hope in his voice was unmistakable. Outside, a church bell chimed 9 o'clock. Somewhere in town, Silas Crow would be gathering his allies, preparing for the confrontation he thought would be a simple matter of law and custom. He didn't know about the Bible, he didn't know about the careful records Pike had kept, and he certainly didn't know about the extraordinary memory of an 8-year-old girl who'd noticed everything and forgotten nothing. The morning light streaming through the basement window felt warm as hope, bright as justice, clear as the truth they were about to bring into the light. Thomas thinks they're safe. He hides them in a doctor's back room while he petitions court. Overseer arrives with patrollers, doctor wavers, Ruth collapses from fever and fear. Thomas is cornered. "Doctor." Marcus Bell lived in a narrow house behind the apothecary, its rooms cramped but clean, and smelling of herbs and carbolic soap. He was a thin man with gentle hands and kind eyes, the sort of physician who'd been known to treat slaves without demanding payment from their masters. When Thomas appeared at his door with Ruth and her children, Bell asked no questions, just ushered them into his back room and closed the door. "The woman needs rest," he said after a quick examination of Ruth. "The birthing was hard on her, and this night's adventure hasn't helped. I can give her something for the pain, but what she really needs is sleep and peace of mind." Thomas watched Ruth settle onto the narrow cot, little Mercy finally content in her mother's arms. Lila sat on a wooden stool nearby, her sharp eyes taking in the doctor's tools and medicines with the same intensity she'd shown for the clerk's seals and ledgers. "I need to go to the courthouse," Thomas told them. "Present our evidence to Judge Cole and request a formal hearing. It could take several hours." "We'll be fine," Ruth said, though her voice was thin with exhaustion. "Lila will watch over things." The child nodded soberly. She'd taken on responsibilities far beyond her 8 years, but she carried them with a poise that continually amazed Thomas. "Doctor." Bell walked Thomas to the front door, his expression troubled. "I've heard talk about town," he said quietly. "Silas Crow's been spreading word that you're helping runaway slaves. Some folks are calling it theft, others are calling it worse. What do you think?" Thomas asked. "I think," Bell said carefully, "that a man's conscience is between him and his maker. But I also know this town, and not everyone here shares that view. Be careful, son. Justice and law don't always walk hand in hand." Thomas left them there, Ruth dozing on the cot, Mercy sleeping against her mother's chest, and Lila keeping watch with the patience of a guardian angel. The morning air was warming as he walked toward the courthouse, and shopkeepers were opening their doors to the day. But he noticed other things too. Men clustered on street corners, their voices low and urgent. Riders coming and going with messages, the kind of activity that suggested news was spreading and sides were being chosen. At the courthouse, he found Judge Abner Cole in his chambers, a stern man with white whiskers and eyes like flint. Cole listened to Thomas's petition without interruption, occasionally asking pointed questions about evidence and witnesses. "This is serious business, young Heir," he said when Thomas finished. "Accusations of fraud, forged documents, unauthorized slave sales. If proven, your overseer could face federal charges. The evidence is clear, Your Honor. The clerk has verified the forgery, and the ledgers show a pattern of theft going back months." Cole leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin. "And this Bible notation from your father? You're certain it's authentic? Josiah Pike has samples of my father's handwriting going back 20 years. He'll testify to its authenticity." Cole stood and walked to his window, gazing out at the town square below. "I'll need to examine all evidence personally before making any ruling. Can you have everything brought here by 3 o'clock? "Yes, sir." "Good. I'll schedule a formal hearing for this afternoon. But son," Cole turned back to face him, his expression grave, "you understand what you're asking? If I rule in favor of manumission, it sets a precedent that could affect every plantation in the county. There are men here who won't take kindly to that." Thomas thought of Ruth's exhausted smile, of Lila's fierce intelligence, of baby Mercy's trusting eyes. "I understand, Your Honor, but some things are more important than keeping the peace." He was walking back through town when he heard the commotion. Shouting voices, the clatter of hooves on cobblestones, the kind of angry noise that drew crowds and promised trouble. Thomas broke into a run, his heart hammering against his ribs as he rounded the corner toward Dr. Bell's street. Silas Crow sat on his horse in front of the doctor's house, flanked by 2 county patrollers and a man Thomas didn't recognize, well-dressed, with the soft look of someone who made his living from other people's labor. A slave trader, most likely, drawn by news of potential profits. "I know they're in there, Bell," Silas was saying, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "Harboring runaway slaves is a federal offense. Stand aside and let us do our duty." Dr. Bell stood on his front porch, his medical bag in one hand and his other hand resting on the doorframe like he was barring entry through will alone. "I have no runaway slaves here," Bell said firmly. "Only a woman who recently gave birth and needs medical attention." "Woman belongs to me," the slave trader interjected. "Bills of sale all proper and legal, doctors interfering with lawful commerce." Thomas felt ice form in his stomach. Somehow, Silas had found a way to forge new papers, new claims of ownership. The man was more cunning than he'd given him credit for. He started forward, but stopped when he heard the sound from inside the house, a woman's cry, thin and desperate. Ruth was in distress, and Lila was with her. "Stand aside, Bell," one of the patrollers said, dismounting from his horse. "We got legal authority here." But before Dr. Bell could respond, the door behind him burst open. Lila flew out like a small fury, her face streaked with tears and her voice carrying clear across the street. "She's dying," she cried. "Mama's burning up with fever, and she can't breathe right." The child's words hit the gathered men like a physical blow. Even Silas looked uncertain, his bluster fading in the face of a child's genuine terror. Dr. Bell immediately turned toward the house. "I need to examine her." "Now wait just a minute," Silas started, but Lila rounded on him with 8 years of fury blazing in her dark eyes. "You did this," she accused. "You and your lies and your stolen papers. Mama was getting better until you came with your threats and your hate." Thomas pushed through the crowd then, his own anger overriding caution. But before he could reach the porch, two more riders appeared at the end of the street, and these wore the blue uniforms of federal marshals. "Well, well," Silas said, his confidence returning. "Look who's come to join the party." The trap was closing, Thomas realized. Somehow, Silas had orchestrated this, the forged ownership papers, the local patrollers, even the federal marshals. He'd turned Thomas's attempt at justice into a federal case of harboring fugitive slaves. And inside the house, Ruth was fighting for her life while her daughters waited to see if freedom was just another word for the thing that would destroy them all. Lila steadies Ruth with pattern breathing, the midwife taught her, and sings a root hymn that gathers neighbors and the Quaker wagoner outside witnesses assembling. Inside Dr. Bell's back room, Ruth lay burning with fever, her breathing quick and shallow like a bird caught in a trap. The stress of the night's journey and the morning's confrontation had pushed her weakened body past its limits. Little Mercy whimpered in her mother's arms, sensing the distress but not understanding its source. Lila knelt beside the cot, her small hands cool against her mother's feverish forehead. She'd seen this before, the way panic and exhaustion could combine to steal a woman's breath and cloud her mind. Aunt Dinah had taught her what to do. "Mama," she said softly, "listen to my voice. Feel my hand on your chest." Ruth's eyes were wide with fear, darting toward the sounds of argument drifting through the thin walls. Outside, men were deciding her fate, with voices loud enough to wake the dead, but Lila focused only on the rhythm of her mother's breathing. "In through your nose, slow and steady," Lila coached. "Like you're smelling Aunt Dinah's herb garden, hold it for 3 heartbeats. Now out through your mouth, like you're blowing out a candle." Ruth tried to follow the pattern, her chest rising and falling in jerky motions. But the fever made everything difficult, and the sound of Silas Crow's voice beyond the door kept spiking her panic. "That's it," Lila murmured. "Now again. In. Hold. Out. Good, Mama. You're doing good." Dr. Bell entered quietly, his face grim as he closed the door behind him. He carried a basin of cool water and several strips of clean cloth, moving with the practiced efficiency of a man who'd seen plenty of medical emergencies. "How is she?" he asked, setting the basin on his work table. "Fever's getting worse," Lila said. "And she can't catch her breath proper. It's like the fear's got hold of her lungs." Bell nodded, wringing out a cloth in the cool water. "Fear can kill as sure as any disease. Help me get these compresses on her arms and forehead. We need to bring that fever down." As they worked, the voices outside grew louder. Lila could hear Thomas arguing with the patrollers, his voice tight with barely controlled anger. Silas was laughing a sound like breaking glass that made her stomach clench with rage. "They think they've got us trapped," she said to Dr. Bell. "Don't they?" he asked quietly, pressing a damp cloth to Ruth's burning forehead. Lila considered this, her mind working like the clockwork mechanism in the courthouse tower. Outside, powerful men with guns and legal papers were deciding their fate, but they'd made one mistake, they thought. They were dealing with ordinary slaves who would cower and submit. They'd forgotten about witnesses. "Dr. Bell," she said suddenly, "do you have another way out of this house? There's a back door that leads to the garden." "Why?" "I need you to open it, and I need you to step outside where folks can see you." Bell studied her face, seeing something there that made him nod slowly. "What are you planning, child?" "Something grandmother taught me," Lila said, "about how music carries on the wind and how the right song at the right time can call people home." She kissed her mother's fevered forehead and handed Little Mercy to Dr. Bell. Then she walked to the back door and opened it wide, letting the morning air flow into the stuffy room. What she did next was something her grandmother had shown her years ago, how certain melodies carried farther than others, how the human voice could cut through noise and confusion to reach hearts that were listening. She began to sing, not loudly, not with the force of desperation, but with the clear, pure tone that came from perfect pitch and generations of musical memory. It was an old song, older than slavery, older than America itself, a song about mothers and children, about journeys through dark places, about the promise of morning light. The melody rose from the doctor's garden and drifted across the neighborhood like smoke from a church fire. It touched the ears of women hanging laundry, of men walking to their shops, of children playing in muddy yards. And because it was Sunday morning and people's hearts were already turned toward spiritual things, They stopped what they were doing to listen. Mrs. Henderson, who ran the boarding house on Maple Street, paused with her arms full of wet sheets. The melody was so beautiful, so filled with longing and hope, that it made her think of her own children grown and gone. Old Samuel, the freedman who swept the courthouse steps, leaned on his broom and closed his eyes. He knew that song, had heard it sung by his own mother before the plantation took her away. Elias Finch, the Quaker wagoner, was loading supplies for his weekly run to the outlying farms when the music reached him. Something in the melody made him think of underground railways and midnight journeys, of the quiet courage required to shepherd souls from bondage to freedom. One by one, they began to walk toward the sound, not hurrying, not with any clear purpose, but drawn by the simple beauty of a child's voice carrying pain and hope in equal measure. They came from different streets and different lives, but the song spoke to something universal, the desire to protect innocence, to stand against cruelty, to bear witness when witness was needed. By the time Leela finished the first verse, 20 people had gathered in the narrow street in front of Dr. Bell's house. By the second verse, there were 40. They didn't speak or interfere, just stood quietly with their Sunday best faces and their weekday hands, creating a wall of humanity around the unfolding drama. Silas Crow looked around at the growing crowd with visible alarm. A few patrollers and a slave trader could handle one young master and his charges, but 40 townspeople, their faces grave and attentive, that was a different kind of problem. "Move along, folks," he called out. "Nothing here that concerns you." "But Mrs." Henderson stepped forward, her grey hair pinned severe, but her eyes warm with maternal concern. "Is that a child singing?" she asked. "Beautiful voice. Reminds me of my Sarah when she was small. Where's the singing coming from?" asked another woman. "Sounds like it's coming from the doctor's house." And suddenly, the crowd's attention shifted from the men with guns to the music drifting from Dr. Bell's garden. They began to move around the side of the house, following the melody like children following the Pied Piper. Elias Finch was among them, his weathered face thoughtful as he listened to Lila's song. When he saw her standing in the garden doorway, a small figure silhouetted against the morning light, her voice rising clear and true above the confusion, his expression shifted to something approaching recognition. "That's the navigation song," he murmured to himself. "The one the conductors use." He began to move through the crowd, not pushing or causing alarm, but positioning himself near the garden gate. Other Quakers in the crowd, and there were several, identifiable by their plain dress and quiet manner, seemed to sense his movement and drifted in his direction. By the time Lila began the third verse, she had gathered more than witnesses. She had gathered allies. The song ended with a note that hung in the air like a promise. In the silence that followed, 40 pairs of eyes turned toward the men with badges and weapons, waiting to see what would happen next. Silas Crow suddenly looked very small and very alone. In the packed courthouse vestibule, Lila points to the ledger totals and the seal chart. The clerk confirms: forged pass, embezzlement trail, infants sold illicitly. The courthouse vestibule buzzed with the energy of a town meeting, though no meeting had been officially called. What had started as a crowd drawn by Leela's song had transformed into something approaching a citizens' assembly, complete with folding chairs someone had brought from the Methodist church and a table borrowed from the general store. Judge Cole stood at the center of it all, his black robes lending gravity to what might otherwise have been dismissed as mob justice. He'd made the decision to move the hearing outside when it became clear that his chambers couldn't hold even a fraction of the people demanding to witness the proceedings. "This is highly irregular," he announced to the assembled crowd. "But given the public nature of the accusations and the federal implications of the charges, I'm willing to conduct a preliminary hearing in the presence of the community." Josiah Pike sat at the borrowed table with his ledgers and seal samples spread before him like a merchant displaying his finest wares. Beside him, Dr. Bell held little mercy, while Ruth, still pale but steady now, sat in one of the Methodist chairs with Lila close by her side. Thomas stood near the judge, the Bible with his father's marginal notes clutched in his hand. The morning's confrontation had left him disheveled but determined, his jaw set with the kind of resolution that comes from having nothing left to lose. Silas Crow occupied the defendant's position, flanked by the slave trader and a lawyer who'd been hastily summoned from the county seat. The federal marshals stood to one side, their faces carefully neutral as they observed the proceedings. "Mr. Pike," Judge Cole began, "you've examined the travel pass in question. What are your findings?" Pike adjusted his wire spectacles and lifted the disputed document. "Your Honor, this pass bears a forged seal and signature. The wax is the wrong color brick red instead of the oxblood I use exclusively for official documents. The signature shows flourishes that are inconsistent with my established hand." He gestured to a comparison chart he'd prepared, showing his authentic signature beside the forged one. "Note the difference in the letter P. Mine is plain and unadorned, while the forgery includes decorative curls that I would never use." A murmur ran through the crowd. "Mrs." Henderson leaned forward in her chair, squinting at the documents. "Clear as day," she pronounced. "My late husband was a clerk himself. I know good penmanship from poor. Furthermore," Pike continued, "the serial number on this pass doesn't match any entry in my official log. It appears to have been fabricated entirely." Silas's lawyer stood up quickly. "Objection, Your Honor. Mistakes in record-keeping don't constitute proof of forgery. Perhaps the clerk simply forgot to log this particular transaction." Pike's eyes flashed behind his spectacles. "Sir, I have logged every official document that has crossed my desk for 7 years. I don't forget." "The child's testimony regarding the ledgers," Judge Cole said. "Let's hear that." Lila stood up, her small form dwarfed by the adults around her but her voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "The numbers don't match," she said simply. "Mr. Crow wrote down costs twice, once where they belonged and once where they didn't. Feed bills, doctor bills, clothes for the hands. Everything doubled." She walked to Pike's table and pointed to specific entries in the plantation ledger. "This line here shows $47.30 for feed costs in March. But 3 pages later, the same amount appears under miscellaneous expenses. Same handwriting, same little smudge where the pen leaked." Elias Finch spoke up from the crowd. "Child's got a remarkable memory. I've seen her watching the ferry operations, remembering things most adults wouldn't notice." "And the unauthorized sales?" Judge Cole prompted. Lila's face grew solemn. "In the back pages, marked with red ribbon. 3 marks for babies sold in the past 2 months, but only 1 death recorded in the plantation records. That means 2 babies were sold without Master Edmund knowing." The silence that followed was profound. Even the slave trader shifted uncomfortably in his seat. "Those are serious accusations," Judge Cole said gravely. "Do you have corroborating evidence?" Pike opened a different ledger, his official record of slave sales in the county. 3 transactions involving infants from the Heir plantation in the past 2 months. Only 1 was recorded with proper paperwork from the estate. The other 2, he paused, checking his notes. The other 2 were conducted with documents bearing the same forged seal we've identified on the travel pass. A woman in the crowd gasped. "Selling babies without their master knowing? That's theft, plain and simple." Silas's lawyer was sweating now despite the cool morning air. "These are complex business matters," he said weakly. "Plantation management involves difficult decisions. Difficult decisions don't require forged papers." Judge Cole interrupted. "Mr. Crow, do you have anything to say in your defense?" Silas stood up slowly, his face red with anger and humiliation. For a moment, it seemed he might confess, might throw himself on the court's mercy and hope for leniency. Instead, he pointed a shaking finger at Thomas. "This is all that boy's doing, trying to protect his slaves from lawful discipline. Everything I did was for the good of the estate, to pay down debts his daddy left behind. By selling infants without authorization?" Judge Cole's voice was dangerously quiet. "By making hard choices that soft-hearted masters won't make themselves." The crowd stirred restlessly at this outburst. Mrs. Henderson muttered something under her breath that sounded distinctly unflattering. Judge Cole raised his hand for silence. "Mr. Pike, in your professional opinion, is there sufficient evidence to support charges of fraud and embezzlement?" "Yes, Your Honor. The documentary evidence is clear and substantial." "And the federal charges regarding forged travel documents?" One of the marshals stepped forward. "More than sufficient, Your Honor. Federal courts don't look kindly on forged interstate commerce papers." Judge Cole nodded grimly. "Then this matter will proceed to formal trial. Mr. Crow, you're hereby remanded into custody pending—" "Wait," Silas's voice cracked like a whip. Wait, there's something else. Something about that Bible the boy's been waving around. Thomas instinctively clutched the Bible tighter. What about it? Silas's smile was ugly, desperate. Ask your precious clerk where that book really came from. Ask him if your daddy really left it in his office, or if someone else delivered it there yesterday. The implication hung in the air like smoke. Pike's face had gone pale, and Judge Cole's eyes sharpened with suspicion. "Mr. Pike," the judge said quietly, "is there something about this Bible's provenance that you haven't shared?" The crowd held its collective breath, waiting to see if their hopes for justice would crumble like sand castles before the tide. The night's detour preserved the Bible dry in Thomas's coat, its margin clause intact. Coupled with fraud evidence, it forces the magistrate's hand. Josiah Pike stood slowly, his thin frame trembling slightly as 40 pairs of eyes focused on him. The morning light streaming through the courthouse windows seemed harsh now, unforgiving, as he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper. "The truth is," he began, then stopped, gathering his courage. "The truth is, Edmund Hale didn't leave that Bible with me for safekeeping." A collective gasp rose from the crowd. Thomas felt the ground shifting beneath his feet, the careful case they'd built threatening to collapse entirely. "He gave it to me yesterday morning," Pike continued, his voice growing stronger. "But not Edmund Hale himself. Edmund Hale has been dead for a week." Silas's triumphant smile began to fade as Pike unfolded the paper in his hands. "This is a letter from Dr. Marcus Bell," Pike said, holding it up for all to see. "Written yesterday morning, delivered to my office by his assistant. It explains how Edmund Hale, knowing he was dying, asked Dr. Bell to witness the writing of a codicil to his will. The Bible notation was witnessed by Dr. Bell and one other person, Mrs. Sarah Henderson. All eyes turned to Mrs. Henderson, who stood up from her Methodist chair with surprising dignity. "That's right," she said firmly. "I was helping nurse Master Hale in his final days. Man was worried sick about what would happen to Ruth and her children after he died. Said he'd seen too much cruelty in his life to let it happen under his own name." Pike nodded gratefully. The Bible was given to Dr. Bell for safekeeping until after the reading of the official will. But when word reached the doctor yesterday that Ruth might be sold illegally, he asked me to examine the codicil for its legal validity. Judge Cole leaned forward, his expression intense. "Are you saying this codicil was properly witnessed according to state law?" "Yes, Your Honor. Dr. Bell and Mrs. Henderson both signed as witnesses, and their signatures are on file with the letter of explanation." Dr. Bell stepped forward from the edge of the crowd, still holding little Mercy in his arms. "Edmund Hale was clear-minded until the very end," he testified. "He dictated the exact wording of the codicil while fully conscious and of sound mind. Said he couldn't sleep easy knowing Ruth and her daughters might be separated after his death. But how do we know the Bible itself survived the night intact?" Silas's lawyer interjected desperately. "These people have been wandering through storms and swamps. Any number of things could have happened to damage or alter the document." That's when Thomas stepped forward, his hand moving to his coat pocket. Throughout the long night, through the storm, the river crossing, the hours in the church cellar, he'd kept the Bible close to his body, protecting it instinctively without fully understanding why. "The storm," he said quietly, and then louder. "The storm is what saved it." He pulled the Bible from his coat, its black leather cover unmarked by water damage. "When we took shelter in St. Mary's Church, I kept this inside my coat the whole time. The cellar stayed dry, but even if it hadn't." He opened the coat and showed them the oilcloth lining a waterproof barrier that hunters and fishermen use to protect their most precious gear. "My father gave me this coat 2 years ago," Thomas continued. "Said a man should always be prepared to protect what matters most. I never understood what he meant until now." Lila spoke up from her place beside her mother. "The Bible never got wet, not even when the ferry hit the tree and we thought we'd lose everything. Mr. Thomas held it against his chest like it was made of gold. Pike examined the Bible carefully, his trained eyes checking for any signs of water damage or recent alteration. The pages were slightly yellowed with age, but perfectly preserved, the ink clear and unfaded. "The handwriting is definitely Edmund Hale's," he pronounced, "and there's no evidence of tampering or recent alteration. This codicil was written exactly as Dr. Bell described." Judge Cole took the Bible and read the marginal notation aloud. If Ruth and her daughters remain together and in good health, they shall be freed upon my death, as befits a Christian conscience. Let no man separate what God has joined in the bonds of motherhood. The words carried across the courthouse vestibule with the weight of prophecy. Ruth's eyes filled with tears, and she pulled Lila close to her side. Combined with the evidence of fraud and embezzlement, Judge Cole continued, this codicil presents a clear legal argument. Mr. Crow's actions to sell Ruth and separate her from her children directly violated the deceased owner's documented wishes. One of the federal marshals stepped forward. Your Honor, if I may, federal law recognizes properly witnessed manumission documents, especially when coupled with evidence that someone attempted to circumvent them through fraudulent means. What are you saying, Marshal? I'm saying this isn't just a local matter anymore. Forging federal documents to prevent lawful manumission is a serious federal crime. Mr. Crow isn't just looking at county charges, he's looking at federal prosecution. Silas had gone white as cotton, the full implications of his situation finally sinking in. His lawyer whispered urgently in his ear, but there was no way to argue with the mountain of evidence stacked against them. Judge Cole stood up, his black robes making him look like an Old Testament prophet delivering judgment. Based on the evidence presented, he announced, I find that Edmund Hale's codicil regarding the manumission of Ruth and her daughters is legally valid and binding. Furthermore, Silas Crow's attempts to circumvent this document through fraud and forgery constitute criminal activity under both state and federal law. The crowd erupted in cheers and applause. Mrs. Henderson was crying openly, and Elias Finch was nodding with the satisfaction of a man who'd seen justice done at last. But Judge Cole wasn't finished. Mr. Crow, you are hereby ordered into federal custody pending trial for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy to violate federal manumission laws. The estate of Edmund Hale will be required to compensate for all financial irregularities identified in the ledger examination. He turned to Thomas, his expression softening slightly. And you, young Hale, are hereby recognized as the legal guardian of Ruth and her daughters, as specified in your father's codicil. The federal marshals will ensure that all proper manumission papers are filed and certified. Thomas felt tears running down his cheeks as the weight of responsibility and relief crashed over him simultaneously. They'd done it. Against all odds, despite fraud and violence and the cruel machinery of slavery itself, they'd found a way to justice. But even as the crowd celebrated around them, he knew this was just the beginning. Freedom papers were one thing, learning how to live in freedom was something else entirely. Lila tugged on his coat sleeve, her young face serious despite the joy around them. Mr. Thomas, she said quietly, what happens now? He looked down at this remarkable child who'd started it all with her sharp eyes and perfect memory, then at Ruth holding her baby daughter close, then at the crowd of neighbors who'd become witnesses to history. Now, he said, we learn how to build something new. Overseer is arrested for fraud. The court recognizes the late owner's margin clause. Ruth and her daughters receive manumission. Thomas accepts reduced inheritance to formalize their freedom. The arrest happened swiftly, with the efficiency of federal authority. The marshals moved through the crowd like men who'd done this before, their blue uniforms cutting a path through the celebrating townspeople. Silas Crow stood frozen as the first marshal approached, his face cycling through disbelief, rage, and finally, a hollow acceptance. Silas Crow, the marshal announced in a voice that carried to every corner of the courthouse vestibule, you are under arrest for conspiracy to defraud the federal government, forgery of interstate commerce documents, and violation of federal manumission laws. The iron shackles clicked around Silas's wrists with a sound that seemed to echo off the courthouse walls. For a man who had spent years wielding absolute power over other human beings, the sudden reversal was devastating. His shoulders sagged as the reality of federal prison settled into his bones. This ain't over, boy, he said to Thomas as the marshals prepared to lead him away. There's others who think like I do, others who won't stand for slaves getting above their station. Then they'll have to answer to the law, Judge Cole said firmly. Just as you have. The crowd parted to let the marshals through, some watching in satisfaction, others in somber recognition that they'd witnessed the end of an era. Mrs. Henderson wiped her eyes with her handkerchief, Whether from joy or the magnitude of the moment, it was hard to say. When the sound of the marshal's horses faded down the street, Judge Cole turned his attention to the formal business of freedom. The matter of manumission papers, he announced, requires certain formalities. Mr. Pike, do you have the appropriate documents? Josiah Pike was already spreading papers across his borrowed table, his precise movements belying the emotion in his voice. I've prepared 3 separate manumission certificates, he said. One for Ruth and individual papers for each daughter. Under federal law, they'll be recognized in any state or territory. Ruth stepped forward slowly, little Mercy in her arms and Lila at her side. For 26 years, she had belonged to other people, first as a child sold away from her birth family, then as a woman whose children could be taken at their owner's whim. Now, for the first time in her life, she was about to belong to herself. There is, Judge Cole said carefully, the matter of compensation to the estate for the loss of property value. The words hit like cold water. Even in freedom, the law insisted on treating human beings as property that had to be paid for. Thomas felt his jaw clench with anger at the absurdity of it all. How much? He asked. Pike consulted a ledger of recent slave sales in the county. For a woman of Ruth's age and condition, plus 2 children, the market value would be approximately $800. $800. It was more money than most working men saw in 2 years, a sum that could buy a small farm or a substantial portion of a business. Thomas thought of his father's estate, the plantation, the house, the remaining slaves whose futures were still uncertain. I'll pay it, he said without hesitation. Son, Judge Cole said quietly, that's a considerable sum. Are you certain the estate can bear it? Thomas looked at Ruth, who was studying her hands with the careful attention of someone afraid to hope too much. He thought of Lila's sharp eyes and perfect memory, of little Mercy's trusting sleep, of the courage it had taken for them to survive the night's journey. The estate will bear what it has to bear, he said. My father made his intentions clear. I won't dishonor them over money. Pike began, filling out the manumission papers with his careful clerk's hand, the scratch of his quill, the only sound in the suddenly quiet vestibule. Each letter and number was a step away from bondage and toward something that had no name yet but felt like possibility. When he finished, he set down his pen and looked at Ruth with genuine warmth. Ruth, formerly property of the Heir estate, you are hereby declared a free woman under the laws of this state and the federal government. Your daughters, Lila and Mercy, are similarly freed and recognized as your legitimate children under law. He handed her the papers, 3 sheets of heavy cream paper with official seals and careful script. The weight of them in her hands was the weight of a life transformed. Ruth's voice, when she finally spoke, was barely above a whisper. What do I call myself now? Been Ruth of Hale Plantation so long, I don't remember having any other name. Ruth Freeman, Lila said immediately. That's what Daddy used to call you when nobody else was listening. He said it was your real name, the one you'd use when you got free. Ruth smiled through her tears. Ruth Freeman. That sounds right. Dr. Bell stepped forward with little Mercy still cradled in his arms. Mrs. Freeman, he said, testing the name with obvious pleasure, you and your daughters will need a place to stay while you decide what comes next. My house isn't large, but you're welcome to the back room for as long as you need it. Elias Finch spoke up from the crowd. The Quaker settlement west of town has families who'd be glad to help, folks who understand what it means to start over in freedom. One by one, other voices joined in offers of work, of shelter, of simple human kindness from people who had started the morning as strangers and ended it as community. Missus Henderson promised sewing work, the Methodist minister offered Sunday dinner, and even old Samuel, the courthouse sweeper, stepped forward with a shy offer to teach Lila her letters if she was interested in proper reading. Thomas watched it all with a mixture of amazement and gratitude. He'd expected the law to be their biggest challenge, but the law had turned out to be the easy part. The real miracle was this, the way ordinary people chose to open their hearts to strangers, to extend hands across the barriers of race and custom and create something new from the raw materials of human decency. There's one more thing, he said when the immediate offers of help had been made. The plantation. It's mine now, legally, but it was built on the labor of enslaved people. That debt has to be acknowledged. Judge Cole raised an eyebrow. "What are you proposing, young man?" Thomas took a deep breath. "I'm proposing to deed portions of the land to the families who worked it, not as gifts, but as wages owed for years of unpaid labor. Let them farm their own acres, build their own homes, make their own futures." The suggestion caused a stir in the crowd. Such a thing was legal but almost unheard of, a radical redistribution of wealth that challenged the very foundations of the plantation system. "That's," Pike began, then stopped, consulting his mental catalogue of legal precedents. "That's perfectly legal, under state law. Unusual, but legal." "It's also expensive," Dr. Bell pointed out gently. "You'd be giving up most of your inheritance." Thomas looked around at the faces surrounding him, black and white, rich and poor, all brought together by a child's song and a mother's courage. "Some things are worth more than money," he said. "My father figured that out at the end. I'd like to think I can learn it at the beginning." Judge Cole nodded slowly. "If you're serious about this, you'll need to draw up proper deeds and have them surveyed and recorded. It's not work you can do overnight." "I'm serious," Thomas said. "And I'll need help, legal help, surveying help, and practical help from people who know the land better than I do." He looked directly at Ruth Freeman now, a free woman standing in the courthouse vestibule with her freedom papers in her hand and her daughters at her side. "I'll need advisors," he continued, "people who understand what it means to work the land, what it means to build something from nothing. Would you consider staying, Mrs. Freeman? Not as a servant, but as a partner?" Ruth's eyes widened. "You're asking me to help run the plantation?" "I'm asking you to help transform it into something better, something that serves the people who work it, instead of the other way around." The silence stretched long enough for a heart to beat a dozen times. Then Lila stepped forward, her young face serious with a wisdom beyond her years. "Mama," she said quietly, "remember what Daddy used to say, about how every ending is also a beginning?" Ruth looked down at her eldest daughter, then at baby Mercy sleeping peacefully in Dr. Bell's arms, then back at Thomas with his earnest young face and his impossible dreams. "Mr. Hale," she said formally, "I accept your offer. But I got conditions of my own. Name them. First, every child on that plantation learns to read and write, black and white together. Second, no family gets separated for any reason, ever. And third," she paused, looking around at the crowd of neighbors who had become witnesses to history. "Third, we do this in the open, with the whole community watching. No secrets, no shame, no hiding what we're building. Let folks see that freedom works when decent people work together." Thomas extended his hand, and Ruth took it in a handshake that felt like the founding of a nation. "Partners," he said. "Partners," she agreed, and in the courthouse vestibule, surrounded by the ordinary heroes of an extraordinary morning, the future began to take shape. Judge pronounces, Ruth and her daughters are manumitted, Silas to stand trial, Edmund's estate docking to cover illegal sums. Thomas surrenders a portion of inheritance to finalize papers. The judge's seal came down with a soft, irrevocable press. Judge Cole worked methodically through the stack of documents Pike had prepared, his movements deliberate and grave as befitted the historic nature of the moment. Each page required his signature, his seal, and his careful notation of the date and circumstances. The scratch of his pen seemed unnaturally loud in the hushed vestibule. "Let the record show," he said as he worked, "that on this 23rd day of September, in the year 1850, the following manumissions have been granted and recorded." He lifted the first document. "Ruth, formerly of the Hale plantation, aged 26 years, is hereby declared a free woman under the laws of this state and the federal government." The words carried weight beyond their legal meaning. For Ruth, they represented the end of a life lived in fear, fear that her children would be sold, that she would be beaten for circumstances beyond her control, that her very existence was subject to another person's whim. Lila, daughter of Ruth Freeman, aged 8 years, is hereby declared free and recognized as a citizen with all rights and privileges thereof. Lila's hand found her locket, fingers tracing the familiar silver surface. Inside was her grandmother's hair and the paper with words she'd never been allowed to learn to read. But that would change now. Freedom meant she could learn anything she set her mind to. Mercy, infant daughter of Ruth Freeman, aged 4 days, is hereby declared free from birth and recognized as a citizen under federal law. Little Mercy stirred in Dr. Bell's arms at the sound of her name, opening dark eyes that would never know the weight of bondage. She would grow up free, not freed, but free from the beginning, with choices and possibilities stretching ahead like an open road. Judge Cole set down his pen and looked up at the assembled crowd. These manumission papers are legal and binding in all states and territories. They supersede any previous bills of sale or ownership claims. No person may legally challenge the freedom of Ruth Freeman and her daughters. Thomas stepped forward with a leather pouch, heavy with coins. "The compensation for the estate," he said formally. $800, Judge Cole confirmed, counting out the money with Pike's assistance. "To be recorded as payment in full for manumission services rendered to the Heir estate." As the coins clinked into the courthouse strongbox, Thomas felt a strange lightness in his chest. The money represented a significant portion of his liquid inheritance, but losing it felt like setting down a burden rather than taking one on. "There is also," Judge Cole continued, "the matter of restitution for fraudulent activities conducted under Silas Crow's management." Pike consulted his ledgers. "Based on the discrepancies we've identified, the estate has been defrauded of approximately $1,200 over the past 18 months. This includes unauthorized slave sales, falsified expense reports, and embezzled funds. Mr. Crow's personal assets will be seized to cover what can be recovered," Judge Cole said, "but the estate has already suffered significant losses." Thomas had expected this. Silas's house and personal property might yield a few $100s, but the man had been spending his stolen money as fast as he made it. Most of the fraud would have to be absorbed by the plantation itself. "I understand, Your Honor. The estate will accept the losses. You're certain? This represents a substantial reduction in your inheritance. The plantation's debts may require you to sell additional property to remain solvent." Thomas looked around the vestibule at the faces watching him. Mrs. Henderson with her maternal concern, Elias Finch with his quiet approval, Dr. Bell holding baby Mercy with gentle hands. These people had chosen to stand witness to something unprecedented, something that challenged the very foundations of their world. "Your Honor," he said clearly, "I'd rather be poor with a clear conscience than rich with blood on my hands. The estate will survive, and it will be stronger for being built on honest labor." A murmur of approval rippled through the crowd. Old Samuel nodded with the satisfaction of a man who had seen justice done at last. Judge Cole made his final notations in the court record. "Let it be recorded that Thomas Hale has voluntarily accepted financial responsibility for all irregularities in the estate's management, and that he has paid full compensation for the manumission of 3 individuals as specified in his father's documented wishes." He closed the ledger with a decisive snap. "This court session is hereby concluded. The papers will be filed with the county clerk and copies forwarded to the Federal Registry in Richmond." As the official business wound down, the human drama continued to unfold. Dr. Bell approached Ruth with little Mercy, his face gentle with the kind of wonder that comes from witnessing transformation. "Mrs. Freeman," he said, "your daughter is hungry. Perhaps we should return to my house so you can feed her in comfort." Ruth nodded gratefully. The morning's excitement had been almost overwhelming, and the reality of freedom was still too new to feel entirely real. She needed quiet time to hold her baby and process the magnitude of what had just happened. But as they prepared to leave the courthouse, Lila tugged on Thomas's sleeve. "Mr. Thomas," she said quietly, "what about the other folks on the plantation? The ones still in bondage?" It was the question Thomas had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure. Ruth and her daughters were free, but 27 other enslaved people remained on the plantation, their futures uncertain. "That's complicated," he said honestly. "The law doesn't give me the right to free them all at once, even if I wanted to. But," he paused, looking down at this remarkable child who never stopped thinking 3 moves ahead, "but there are things I can do. Better conditions, wages for work, education opportunities, and over time, as the plantation becomes profitable under honest management, there may be opportunities for more manumissions." Lila nodded solemnly. "Grandmother always said change comes slow but sure, like the tide. You can't stop it once it starts moving. Your grandmother was a wise woman." "Yes, sir." She was. Lila's hand moved to her locket again, a gesture that was becoming as natural as breathing. I think she'd be proud of what happened here today. Thomas thought of his own father, lying 3 days buried in the plantation cemetery. Edmund Hale had lived most of his life accepting the cruelties of the slave system, but in the end, he'd found the courage to write justice into the margins of his Bible. Maybe that was how change really happened, not through grand gestures or sudden transformations, but through ordinary people making better choices than they'd made before. A clerk keeping careful records, a doctor opening his home to strangers, a crowd of neighbors choosing to witness justice instead of turning away, a young man learning that some things mattered more than money, a child with perfect pitch and a perfect memory, singing the truth until people couldn't help but listen. As they walked out of the courthouse into the afternoon sunshine, Thomas felt the weight of the future settling on his shoulders. It wouldn't be easy transforming a plantation built on forced labor into something sustainable and just. There would be resistance from other planters, economic challenges, and the constant pressure of a society that profited from human bondage. But walking beside Ruth Freeman as she carried her freedom papers in one hand and her baby daughter's future in the other, Thomas thought maybe, just maybe, they could build something worth the struggle. The morning had started with a beating in a kitchen. It was ending with a new family walking toward a different kind of home. Not a perfect ending, but a beginning with hope in it, which was more than any of them had dared expect when the sun first rose on this extraordinary day. New household charter, spoken aloud by Reverend Brooks. Thomas pledges guardianship and stipend. Community witnesses sign. Enemy converts. A former patroller removes his hat, asks forgiveness. Quilts unfurled from the church rail like bright banners. The afternoon sun slanted through the great elm trees as the crowd moved from the courthouse to the Methodist church across the square. What had begun as a legal hearing had transformed into something approaching a community celebration, with neighbors bringing covered dishes and children running between the adults with the particular energy that comes from sensing something important in the air. Reverend Matthew Brooks emerged from the church carrying a worn leather Bible and a look of profound satisfaction. He was a tall man with kind eyes and the weathered hands of someone who'd done his share of manual labor before answering the call to ministry. When Mrs. Henderson had explained the morning's events and asked if the church might provide space for what she called a proper blessing, he'd opened the doors without hesitation. "Folks," he called out, his voice carrying across the churchyard, "if you'll gather here on the steps, we'll make this official in the sight of God and community." Thomas stood with Ruth and her daughters at the center of the group, still somewhat amazed to find himself at the heart of what felt like a moment of historical significance. The legal papers were safely tucked in his coat pocket, but somehow this gathering of neighbors felt more important than all the official seals and signatures. "Thomas Hale," Reverend Brooks began, "do you, in the presence of these witnesses and before Almighty God, pledge to serve as guardian and protector to Ruth Freeman and her daughters?" "I do," Thomas said clearly. "And do you pledge to provide them with fair compensation for their labor, decent living conditions, and the opportunity to build independent lives as free citizens?" "I do." "Ruth Freeman, do you accept Thomas Hale's offer of partnership in the transformation of the plantation known as Willowbrook, with the understanding that you enter this agreement as a free woman with full legal rights?" Ruth's voice was steady, despite the magnitude of the moment. "I do." "And do you pledge to work together in good faith to create a community where all people are treated with dignity and respect, regardless of the color of their skin?" "We do," they said together. Reverend Brooks opened his Bible to a passage he'd marked with a ribbon from the book of Deuteronomy. "Justice, justice you shall pursue, that you may thrive and occupy the land that the Lord your God is giving you." He closed the book and looked out at the assembled crowd. Justice isn't just a legal concept, friends. It's a daily choice we make in how we treat our neighbors, how we respond to need, and how we build communities that reflect God's love rather than human prejudice. "Mrs. Henderson stepped forward with a piece of paper and a pen. "I've prepared a document for those who wish to sign as witnesses to this arrangement," she announced. "Nothing legal, mind you, but a record of what happened here today." One by one, they came forward to sign. Josiah Pike, with his precise clerk's handwriting. Dr. Bell, still holding Little Mercy. Elias Finch, and 3 other Quakers from the settlement west of town. Mrs. Henderson herself, her signature bold and confident. Old Samuel approached slowly, his weathered hands trembling slightly as he took the pen. "Can't write much," he admitted, "but I can make my mark. Been waiting 73 years to see a day like this." Even some of Thomas's neighbors from other plantations stepped forward to sign, though he noticed several others had quietly slipped away during the ceremony. Change always had its supporters and its opponents, and today had probably created as many enemies as allies. That's when Jake Morrison approached the group. Jake was one of the county patrollers who'd arrived with Silas that morning, a man whose job it was to track down runaway slaves and maintain the racial order that kept white society comfortable. He was a big man with scarred hands and the kind of reputation that made slaves cross to the other side of the street when they saw him coming. He stood at the edge of the group for several minutes, his face working through some internal struggle. Finally, he removed his hat and stepped forward. "Mrs. Freeman," he said, his voice rough with emotion, "Ma'am, I owe you an apology." Ruth studied his face, seeing something there that made her nod for him to continue. "I've been in the business of keeping folks like you in chains for 15 years, he said. "Told myself it was the law, told myself it was necessary, told myself it was God's will. But watching that little girl of yours sing this morning, listening to the courage in your voice when you testified," he paused, struggling with the words. "I seen what I've been doing to families like yours. I seen it clear for the first time, and I'm ashamed." He reached into his vest and pulled out his patroller's badge, a brass star that represented legal authority to pursue, capture, and return human beings to bondage. "I won't be needing this anymore," he said, setting it on the church steps. "A man's got to be able to look at himself in the mirror, and I ain't been able to do that for some time now." The silence that followed was profound. Even the children had stopped their playing to watch this unexpected moment of transformation. Ruth looked at Jake for a long moment, then at the badge glinting in the afternoon sun, then back at his weathered face. "Mr. Morrison," she said quietly, "I accept your apology, and I hope you find peace in whatever you choose to do next." Jake nodded gratefully and stepped back into the crowd, but he didn't leave. Instead, he took off his coat and rolled up his sleeves. "If you're looking for hands to help build something better on that plantation," he said to Thomas, "I know farming, and I'm tired of being on the wrong side of justice." Thomas extended his hand, and Jake shook it with the grip of a man making a new beginning. "We can use all the help we can get," Thomas said. As the formal ceremony concluded, and people began to drift toward the covered dishes that had appeared on tables borrowed from the church basement, Lila slipped away from the crowd and climbed onto the church steps. From her dress pocket, she pulled out the ribbon that usually held her hair back and began threading it through the handle of the lantern Thomas had carried through their night journey. "What are you doing, child?" Mrs. Henderson asked. "Making it permanent," Lila said seriously, "so we remember what happened here today. So nobody can pretend it was a dream or a mistake." She held up the lantern, its metal warm from the afternoon sun and its glass clear as hope. The ribbon fluttered in the breeze like a small flag of victory. "This light carried us through the dark," she said. "Now it's going to light our way forward." Thomas felt tears prick his eyes as he understood what she was doing. The lantern would hang in their new home, whatever and wherever that turned out to be, as a reminder that justice was possible when ordinary people found the courage to do extraordinary things. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the crowd began to disperse, families heading home with stories that would be told around dinner tables for generations, Ruth stood on the church steps holding her daughters and watching the sun paint the world gold. For the first time in 26 years, she was exactly where she chose to be, with the people she loved most, planning a future that belonged to her. It was, she thought, the most beautiful sight she'd ever seen. On the church steps, Lila threads her ribbon through the lantern handle. Ben starts a porch hymn, voices layer old and young. Mule nuzzles Mercy's blanket. The first note rose and held like a hand at the small of their backs. Ben Carter had arrived late to the ceremony, his stable hand clothes dusty from a day's hard work, and his hat clutched nervously in his weathered hands. He'd heard about the morning's events from 3 different people, each telling the story with growing amazement, and he'd walked the 2 miles from his farm to see for himself if what they said was true. Now he stood at the back of the crowd watching Thomas Hale shake hands with a former slave patroller, watching Ruth Freeman hold her freedom papers like they were made of spun gold, watching little Lila thread her hair ribbon through a lantern handle with the solemnity of a priestess performing a sacred ritual. Ben had been born into slavery 43 years ago, had bought his own freedom with money earned from weekend carpentry work, and had spent the last 8 years walking the narrow path that freedmen navigated between two worlds. He knew the sound of hope when he heard it, and he knew the rarity of moments when hope became real. So when the crowd began to quiet and people started gathering their things to head home, Ben Carter opened his mouth and let the old song out. Swing low, sweet chariot. His voice was rough from years of calling to horses and mules, but it carried the weight of experience and the sweetness of gratitude. The melody was one that every person in the crowd knew, whether they'd learned it in slave quarters or Methodist hymnals. Mrs. Henderson's voice joined his on the second line, her clear soprano weaving around his bass like silver thread through burlap. Then, Dr. Bell added his tentative tenor, and Reverend Brooks his confident baritone. Coming for to carry me home. One by one, other voices joined the growing chorus. Elias Finch and his fellow Quakers, their plain clothes and quiet manner belying the strength of their conviction. Old Samuel, his voice cracked with age but steady with faith. Even Jake Morrison, the former patroller, humming quietly in the back of the group. The song wasn't just music, it was testimony, confession, and prayer all rolled into one. Every voice that joined it carried its own story of struggle and hope, of moments when the world seemed too heavy to bear, and faith was the only thing that kept feet moving forward. Lila's voice soared above the rest, her perfect pitch finding harmonies that made the simple melody rich and complex. Ruth held Little Mercy close and added her own voice to the mix, tears streaming down her face as 26 years of suppressed song finally found their freedom. Even the animals seemed to sense the significance of the moment. Caesar, the mule, who'd been grazing peacefully in the churchyard, lifted his grey head and walked slowly toward the group. His large brown eyes were gentle as he approached Ruth and her daughters, and when he reached them, he lowered his great head and nuzzled Mercy's blanket with surprising delicacy. The baby stirred at the touch, opening her dark eyes and looking up at the massive face above her without fear. Her tiny hand emerged from the blanket and brushed against the mule's soft nose, and Caesar snorted gently, a sound that seemed almost like laughter. "Look at that, Mrs." Henderson whispered between verses. "Even the animals know something special happened here today." The song continued, verse after verse, as if no one wanted the moment to end. Children who'd been playing tag among the elm trees stopped their games and edged closer to the music. Shop owners emerged from their stores to listen. Even the horses tied to hitching posts along the square seemed to settle into stillness, their ears pricked forward attentively. Thomas found himself thinking of his father, wondering if Edmund Hale had ever imagined that his carefully written Bible notation would lead to this black voices and white voices raised together in celebration of freedom, a community coming together to witness something unprecedented and precious. As the song drew to its natural close, the voices gradually faded until only Ben Carter's bass remained, holding the final note like a promise that echoed off the church walls and drifted across the square. In the silence that followed, no one moved. The moment felt too fragile to disturb, too important to end with ordinary words or ordinary actions. Finally, Lila spoke, her young voice clear in the gathering dusk. "That's the most beautiful thing I ever heard," she said simply. "Child," Ben Carter replied, his eyes bright with unshed tears. "That's the sound of freedom. Take it with you wherever you go, and teach it to your children so they never forget what it cost to get here." Ruth nodded solemnly, understanding that she was being entrusted with more than just a song. She was being given the responsibility to remember this day, to carry its meaning forward into whatever future they would build together. As the crowd finally began to disperse, people drifting away in twos and threes with quiet voices and thoughtful expressions, Thomas gathered his small family, for that's what they were now, he realized, bound together by choice and circumstance, and the kind of love that grows from shared struggle. "Ready to go home?" he asked. Ruth looked around at the church steps where she'd stood as a free woman for the first time, at the people who'd witnessed her transformation from property to person, at the lantern in Lila's hands that would light their way into an uncertain but hopeful future. "Yes," she said quietly, "let's go home." And as they walked away from the Methodist church toward whatever tomorrow would bring, the echo of Ben Carter's hymn seemed to follow them, a reminder that some songs are too important to end, too powerful to contain, and too true to forget. The ribbon fluttered from the lantern handle like a small flag of victory, and the last light of day painted everything the color of possibility. Papers copied, Pike gives certified duplicates, relocation to safety arranged to a nearby Quaker farm under the 1,850 risks. Thomas repeats, softly but for all to hear, "You're coming with me." They step into the wagon. Lila looks back once. Lantern light in the wagon hood, Bible under Ruth's arm, the seal's red circle drying like a small sun. The copying of the papers took place in Josiah Pike's basement office as the sun set over the town square, painting the windows red and gold. Pike worked by lamplight, his careful hand transcribing every word of the manumission documents onto fresh paper, while Thomas and Ruth watched nervously from wooden chairs. "Federal law requires that freed people carry proof of their status at all times," Pike explained as he wrote. "Original documents can be lost, stolen, or destroyed. These copies will be just as legally binding as the originals." He prepared 3 sets, one for Ruth to carry, one for Thomas to keep in case of emergency, and a third for the Federal Registry in Richmond. Each copy required his official seal and signature, the red wax leaving perfect impressions that caught the lamplight like tiny suns. "The Fugitive Slave Act of 1,850, Pike continued grimly, "makes your situation more dangerous than it would have been just a few years ago. Any freed person can be accused of being a runaway, and the burden of proof falls on them to demonstrate their legal status." Ruth's hand moved instinctively to the papers tucked inside her dress. The morning's joy was tempered now by the reality of the world they still lived, in a world where freedom was legal but not necessarily safe. "That's why," Elias Finch said from the corner where he'd been waiting patiently, "we think it's best if you come with me tonight. My farm is 15 miles west, near the Quaker settlement. You'll be among friends there, and farther from anyone who might want to challenge your status." Thomas looked up from the Bible he'd been reading. His father's careful script in the margins seemed to glow in the lamplight. "What about the plantation? The plans we discussed?" "The plans we'll keep," Elias said kindly, "but Mrs. Freeman and her daughters need immediate safety. There's been talk in the taverns already, men who didn't like what happened here today, men who think it sets a dangerous precedent." Ruth shifted Little Mercy in her arms and looked at Lila, who sat quietly in the corner with her ribbon-decorated lantern. The child had been unusually subdued since leaving the church, as if the weight of their new freedom was finally settling into her 8-year-old consciousness. "What do you think, baby?" Ruth asked her eldest daughter. Lila considered the question with characteristic seriousness. "I think we should be careful," she said finally. "Freedom's like a newborn, precious and fragile. We need to protect it until it gets strong enough to protect itself." Pike finished the last document and set down his pen with a satisfied sigh. "There. Everything in order. Mrs. Freeman, you now have certified proof of your freedom that will hold up in any court in the country." As if summoned by the completion of their business, "Doctor." Bell appeared in the doorway carrying a medical bag and wearing a traveling coat. "I'm coming with you," he announced. "At least until we're certain there are no medical complications from the birth or the strain of recent events." Elias nodded approvingly. "My wagon's waiting behind the church. We can leave quietly, without drawing attention." Thomas stood up, the weight of separation settling into his chest like a stone. For 12 hours, he and Ruth had been partners in an extraordinary adventure. Now practical necessities were pulling them apart, at least temporarily. "This isn't goodbye," he said quietly. "It's just, see you soon." Ruth smiled, understanding what he couldn't quite put into words. "Partners don't abandon each other. We'll do our work from different places for now, but we'll do it together." They gathered their few possessions, the lantern, the Bible, Aunt Dinah's herb bundle, and the precious freedom papers. Outside, Elias's wagon waited in the shadow of the church, its canvas hood offering privacy and protection for the journey ahead. As they prepared to climb aboard, Thomas found himself remembering the moment that morning when he'd first spoken the words that changed everything. Standing on the plantation porch with Silas Crow and the patrollers watching, he'd claimed Ruth and her daughters as his wards. Now, in the gathering darkness behind the Methodist church, he spoke those words again, not as a claim of ownership, but as a promise of partnership. "You're coming with me," he said softly, but loud enough for everyone to hear. "Not as my property, not as my servants, but as my partners in building something better." Ruth's eyes filled with tears as she understood the transformation those simple words had undergone in a single day. This morning they'd meant rescue. Tonight they meant respect. She took his offered hand and stepped up into the wagon, settling onto a cushion of quilts and straw. "Doctor." Bell climbed up beside Elias on the driver's seat, his medical bag secure between his feet. Lila was the last to board, pausing at the wagon's tailgate to look back at the town where her life had changed forever. The courthouse stood dark and solid against the star-filled sky. The Methodist church's bell tower rose like a finger pointing toward heaven. "You'll remember this place?" Thomas asked. "I remember everything," Lila said simply. "That's my gift and my burden." She climbed into the wagon and settled beside her mother, the lantern glowing softly in her lap. Its light illuminated the small family, Ruth with baby Mercy sleeping against her chest, the Bible tucked securely under her arm, and the freedom papers rustling gently with each movement of the wagon. Elias clicked his tongue to the horses, and they began to move slowly through the dark streets of town. A few windows glowed with lamplight, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked once and fell silent. As they rolled past the courthouse, Lila held up the lantern so its light fell across the stone steps where Judge Cole had pronounced their freedom. The red wax seal on the official documents was dry now, set permanent as the promise it represented. "A small son," she whispered, touching the lantern's glass with one finger, "carrying us toward the morning." Ruth pulled her daughters close as the wagon carried them into the darkness beyond town. Behind them lay the plantation where they'd been born into, bondage. Ahead lay a Quaker farm where they would learn what it meant to be free. And in the space between, in the gentle rocking of the wagon, the soft glow of the lantern, and the steady rhythm of horses' hooves on packed earth, lay all the possibilities that freedom could offer to those brave enough to claim them. The small sun of their freedom rolled steadily through the night, carrying its light toward whatever dawn was waiting to receive it. In a land ruled by whips and ledgers, a child's clear-sung hymn and keen eyes became the map out toward manumission, mercy, and found family.